I did.
Thank you.
Well, we all know who you are. For the record, will you state your name?
Yes, Shawntae Devon Hardy.
Where do you live?
Columbus, Ohio.
How long have you lived there?
All of my life.
Grew up there?
Yes.
Where did you live when you were growing up there in Columbus?
I lived at Fairwood and Mooberry and Fairwood and Livingston area.
Generally speaking, is that in the area Columbus?
Yes, it's in Columbus.
Is that near Livingston?
Yes.
We've been talking about that?
Yes, yes, sir.
How far is that Speedway gas station from where your mother lives?
I'm sorry, say that
How
again?
far is that gas station, the Speedway that we heard testimony about, from where your mother lives?
Oh, approximately 8 minutes.
You've heard the charges against you,
Yes.
and you've been aware of them since when?
The charges I was presented with my indictment since October 14th, 2021.
And you've thought about them?
Yes, I have.
You've studied them?
Yes, I have.
Analyzed them?
Yes.
Did you represent yourself to others as a funeral director?
No, sir, I have not.
Did you abuse corpses?
No, sir, I have not.
Did you intentionally write checks that would bounce?
No, sir.
Did you use a motor vehicle beyond the consent you had received?
No, sir, I did not.
Did you fail to pay any taxes of which you were aware?
No, sir. None of that I was aware.
Did you operate an unlicensed funeral home?
No, sir.
Did you try to intimidate Asia Lucky?
No, sir.
So far as you know, was she paid the amount of money that she felt was due?
Yes.
Tell the judge about your background, Sean. Where did you grow up?
Yes. So my background started in Columbus, Ohio. Grew up there, was born there, grew up there. Was raised at First Mount Carmel Baptist Church in Columbus, Ohio. My grandfather was the First Mount Carmel Baptist Church.
Slow down a little.
I'm sorry, I apologize. That was at First Mount Carmel Baptist Church. I was raised in the church by my mother and by my grandmother, also under the instruction of my grandfather. I went to high school in Columbus, Ohio. And
where?
I went to St. Charles Preparatory College School, and then I didn't finish at St. Charles, ended up going to Heritage Christian Academy. And from Heritage Christian Academy, I didn't finish there. I went to prison when I was about 20 years old, and it was there that I received my GED.
For what did you go to prison?
It was a Noble Correctional Institution in 2000.
What was the crime?
Unauthorized use of a motor vehicle.
How long were you there?
I think 80 days.
Since your release, have you been in trouble again?
No, sir. Well, one time.
For what?
That was for, I was renting out a property in Akron, Ohio, a house that we had. I had allowed people to come in to use the property, and I was charged with permitting drug abuse based upon the fact that I had explained to the police I knew that people there had used marijuana.
Tell us a little bit about your family. We heard about your mother, your grandmother, your grandfather. Did you have any brothers and sisters?
Yes, I have brothers and sisters. I have one brother now who lives in the state of Montana, and I have some other brothers and sisters and siblings who live in Texas.
Nobody else in Columbus?
Nobody else, no siblings in Columbus.
When you were growing up, did there come an occasion when you went to work in a funeral home?
Yes, at 12 years old.
Can you tell the judge how that came about?
Yes, my grandfather was very good friends with a funeral director by the name of Mr. J.W. Ross. Mr. Ross was at that time burying a cousin of mine by the name of Marshawn. So at the funeral, I was just impressed with what Mr. Ross was doing and with his cars and how he was. He was a great man. Shorter man, but just a very big personality. And I told my grandfather that, I told my granddad, I said, Granddad, I want to work where this guy works at.
How old were you at the time?
I was 12. So Mr. Ross, my grandfather talked to Mr. Ross and told him that, he wants a job. Would you consider hiring on? And Mr. Ross said, absolutely, I would love to have him. And I was a little large-sized kid, so he said I could use the muscle. And I went to work for Mr. Ross ever since at 12 years old.
And what were you doing?
I started off just kind of sweeping floors, handing out programs, cleaning the bathrooms and the toilets, going with Mr. Ross on transportation and what he referred to as death calls. At that time, I was just going picking up bodies is what I was calling it. I would greet families as they came through the door, and then after services, clean up the chairs and stuff like that, and stack the chairs and put all the equipment back where it belonged.
But you were picking up dead bodies at 12?
With Mr. Ross, yes, sir.
When did you stop working at the funeral home?
When did I stop working at the funeral home? Oh, probably right before I got called to go to pastor the church where I am in Akron, Ohio.
Now, when would that have been, or what age were you?
I was 27 when I was called, 26 when I was called to the church, 27 when I actually started pastoring.
I think I know what you mean by it, but can you tell us what you mean by called?
Well, what happens is that churches will seek out what is for potential candidates for the ministry or to be the senior pastor of the church. To my understanding, what was told to me, they had asked for recommendations from the National Baptist Convention of local ministers or pastors in an area that would be considered a good candidate to pastor the church. So that's what they had told me that they did, and subsequently they called me one day, asked me would I would come and try out. I told them I would, and then they voted for me. I think it was about maybe a month and a half later after hearing some other candidates.
How long have you worked at the Greatest Missionary Baptist Church?
Since 2007.
Still with us, Nima Rahmani. Nima, I'd like to get your impression not only of the demeanor of the defendant as he starts testifying about 37 indictment counts and 7 more, but also his size as we were watching him walk up to the witness stand.
Well, actually, he's larger than life, and this is important. This case is going to come entirely down to Hardin's testimony, because he, of course, is going to say that he was helping folks who didn't have money during a very sad time in their lives, grieving the loss of their loved ones. And of course, the victims are going to say that he was misrepresenting facts and taking money from them and defrauding them. So his testimony about his intentions and what he did is really going to make or break this case.
And I like the way that the defense attorney started off. He went through every count to say, did you do this? Did you represent as a funeral director? No. Did you intend to bounce checks? No. Through every aspect of the counts that he's facing. Nima, stay with us. We have to squeeze in a break. You're not going to miss any of the defendant's testimony. First witness on the stand for the defense, the defendant himself, Shante Hardin. We'll be back after a quick break.
Right now.
Welcome back to Court TV Live. I'm Judge Ashley Wilcott. Thank you for being with us this afternoon. As an update, the Parkland school shooter, the case in Florida against Nicholas Cruz, is on recess for the day. So there's no more trial today. They'll resume tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. I want to turn our attention to the breaking news. An Ohio case against Shante Hardin. This is a case you've been following along online and watching. He's on the stand. He's testifying. He was charged in October of 2021 with 37 counts and then an additional 7 counts in December of 2021, running a fake funeral home, basically. It's saying that he was misrepresenting himself as a funeral director, that he mishandled and abused corpses. Serious allegations. Now, the prosecution had witness after witness describing what they went through for the lack of proper burial of the decedents, of their family members who had passed away. Now the defendant's on the stand. He's actually the 4th witness for the defense, testifying to this jury about why he didn't do anything wrong and that he did not commit any of these alleged crimes. We hit the pause button. You haven't missed any of his testimony. Let's get you back into the courtroom.
What does the senior pastor of that church do?
Everything. As senior pastor, my number one goal is to spiritually feed a flock of people, to be able to develop them in Scripture and to develop them in as much character as the Bible should tell them, and to lead them, to guide them, to steer them in the right direction. Also an overseer of Christian education, working with the youth and young adult departments, overseeing the deacons or trustees, making decisions every day to keep a church alive.
Counseling the parishioners?
Counseling parishioners, marriages, funeral aspects, all of those things.
Now, when you were counseling people in the funeral aspects, what sort of discussions were had?
Well, in terms of all types of discussions will come up in this situation dealing with my church members. One of the problems that they had always run into is that they felt that funeral homes were overpriced and overcharging them. So they would come to the church and ask for financial help in terms of trying to get a loved one buried or cremated or whatever disposition that they were choosing to do, and the church would essentially have to come out of thousands and hundreds of dollars to help get someone buried or cremated.
You authorize that?
Yes.
Did that bother you?
It does bother me, yes.
Did you give any thought to trying to do something about it?
Yes.
What thought did you give to trying to do something about it?
Well, my thoughts were in terms of helping people, because I know about the funeral business. I came into pastoring understanding about the funeral business. So the first thing that I would do is just talk to the funeral home and let them know, hey, you're selling this casket for $2,000 or $3,000, but they can go to the wholesaler themselves and purchase this casket for $400 or $500. Sometimes I would encourage that. The families would do that. For instance, if there was another part of the service that a family member or even a friend or anybody could do, I would encourage the family or the friend to be able to handle those portion of services as well. And those costs would be at sometimes, at that time, 15 years ago, $5,000, $6,000, $7,000. Now with the involvement of some outside help, that bill would dwindle down to $3,000, just as an example.
Would you communicate that to your parishioners when you're counseling them?
Yes.
On a different point, do you have the view that your obligations as a Christian pastor stops when you leave the church door?
Can you repeat that question?
Sure. Do you have the sense that your obligations as a Christian pastor stops when you leave the church door?
My obligation as a pastor is to my church and to the entire Christian community. So in terms of, if you're asking me if I'm just, because I'm the senior pastor of Greater Faith Baptist Church, does my role begin and end there? No. My role is for an entire community of believers.
Did there come a time when you enrolled in a mortuary school in Pittsburgh?
Yes.
When was that?
That was somewhere around 2012, 2013, I believe, is when I started at mortuary school.
Why did you do that?
Just because I had wanted to get more ingressed into the funeral business, and in terms of becoming a funeral director. That's why I went to mortuary school, and because I love it. I love the mortuary industry as a whole.
What aspects of it do you love?
I love helping families, because sometimes families get taken advantage of in certain different ways, because the funeral industry has, for lack of a better term, abused a lot of things. I love the ability to help a family who does not know how to get through the process, and you're able to show them and help them lead them, guide them of the process. What they cannot do for themselves, there are people that can help them in that process. I love the fact about being able to put it all together, that like anything, like a wedding, there are the same aspects of a funeral, but instead of people getting married, there's a separation of life that goes into the transition of death. So when people need the help in terms of the actual event of the funeral itself, I love to be able to have them walk in and see everything put together. The flowers that match the casket and the programs, and in the church is set up properly the way that they wanted it and what they probably didn't expect, or is better than what they expected. And the relief that comes upon them when they see and they have that. That's what I love.
Now, in fairness, that doesn't always happen.
In terms of
Everything going well.
sometimes not.
People make mistakes.
It can happen.
Can it be confusing when you have multiple family members trying to control the process?
Often.
And what's the problem there?
Well, when you begin to start to talk to the family, they want to start the consultation process and the process of the funeral planning and these things, that you have sometimes 5 or 6 individuals. Sometimes you have a house full of people, and they're all trying to give orders, but you may only have 1 or 2 people that you have to focus on. Well, you focus on those 1 or 2 people who are, as we call them, kind of the shot callers, the people who are making the decisions. And what happens is that you have people who are not decision makers, who are not in control, trying to tell you what to do and how to do it. So what happens is those people may show up and say, oh, I don't like this, I don't like that. But the fact of the matter is they're not the person who was in control of anything.
I assume that at the time you're counseling a family who's just lost a loved one, there's a considerable emotional distress on those people.
Yes.
Can that make it hard for you to communicate with them?
Yes, sometimes.
And can that make it hard for them to communicate with you?
Yes, sometimes, yes.
Did you graduate from mortuary school?
No, sir, I did not.
Why not?
Well, about the end part of 2013, 2014, there was calls placed to my school. Those calls came from representatives and investigators from the Ohio Board of Embalmers and Funeral Directors. From my understanding, what was told to me by the president of the school and other facility members that, you know, Sean, they talk about you're a bad guy and you don't belong in the funeral business. And eventually, at that time, I think it was the president or the dean of students thought there wasn't a place for me at the mortuary school.
You were asked to leave.
Basically, yes.
What had you learned at the mortuary school in the time you were there?
I had learned everything from business law to cosmetics, dressing the body, microbiology, different aspects of how to put funerals together, sociology, psychology, all of those different types of classes when I was in mortuary school.
And was the mortuary school a place where you had to reside in Pittsburgh to go to classes?
You didn't have to reside in Pittsburgh, so sometimes I was in Pittsburgh for like a week or 2 at a time. Then most of the time, though, I would just travel back and forth every day from Akron to Pittsburgh every day.
Did you continue to serve as a senior pastor?
Yes.
Have you told people that you were a funeral director?
No, sir, I have not stated that, no.
How can you be so sure?
Just because in an aspect that I'm asked to serve, it is not in a funeral director capacity, that there would be no reason for me to have to explain that I'm a funeral director or I'm a licensed funeral director in order to be able to help and serve a family in the state of Ohio.
Were you aware that the Board of Embalmers and Funeral Directors was investigating you?
Yes.
Did that factor into your thinking at all?
Yeah, absolutely.
In what way?
Well, in several different ways, if you allow me to go back a little bit.
Sure.
First in 2013, when I was at maybe 2014 or 15, I was at the Owens Funeral Home, working with the funeral directors at Owens Funeral Home.
Okay, let's slow down. Where is Owens?
In Columbus, Ohio.
And how do you come to be working there when you're living in Akron?
Because the funeral director, we had another funeral home. She went over because the funeral director of Owens, she was ill and ended up moving to, I think, to the state of Texas, and she needed somebody to come in and run her funeral home. And that person was also a good friend of mine, but more so, they were the director of the funeral home that I used to work for.
And who is that good friend?
That was Roberta Brady.
And we've heard testimony that she lost her license. Do you know that?
Yes, sir.
Do you recall when that happened?
I want to say, I'm not exactly sure when she lost her license, but I think it happened around somewhere around 2018, somewhere in there, from my understanding.
Were you ever involved in what she was doing that led to the loss of her license?
No, I was under the impression she lost her license just because she didn't renew it.
What did you do at Owens?
I would assist in transportation of the bodies. Then when the bodies would come up to the second level, that's when I would kind of start to do what they asked me to do in terms of...
So those of us who haven't been at the Owens Funeral Home, what do you mean about come up to the second level?
Okay, so, well, the Owens Funeral Home is also shared with the Cook and Son Funeral Home. State of Ohio allows you to share a funeral home. You can have multiple licenses with one funeral home that held multiple licenses. So
Shante Harden is a fast talker, and he did say he serves, but not as a funeral director. Let us know what you think on social media. Do you believe him or not? We need to take a break. When we come back, we'll get you back in where we've left off.
Visit lemonadehealth.com.
This defendant would brazenly represent himself as a funeral director. Defendant didn't own a funeral home.
The families needed to get the person buried, and that's what he was doing.
He would return the cremated remains.
There was a shortage of urns.
The state of the body was such, it was so decomposed that the worker got violently ill.
What's the advantage to Mr. Harden of having bodies in his possession not disposed of? None.
And now that defendant, Shante Harden, is on the stand testifying on his own behalf, trying to convince the judge, because this is a bench trial, so there's no jury, trying to convince this judge that he is not guilty of all the counts against him. One of the things he's already said during his testimony just a few minutes ago that you watched, I love being a funeral director because sometimes families get taken advantage of. We did hit the pause button. Let's get you back into court. You haven't missed any of Mr. Harden's testimony.
It's licensed at the Cook and Son Pally Funeral Home.
What was it?
Cook and Son Pally Funeral Home. So essentially what happens is that person who's being transported in, the decedent, they go to the lower level and their embalming would take place. That person would then be elevated to the second level, which is where I would come in and do all the dressing, casketing, cosmetizing, getting that person ready for their funeral and burial services by, like I said, getting them dressed, getting them casketed, and then escorting the families in, later on that evening or the next day, so they could be viewed.
And how long did you do that?
With Owens, I probably did it for about 7 months, I believe.
Are you going back and forth to Akron at this point from Columbus?
Yes, I do.
Your mother still lives in Columbus.
My mother still lives in Columbus.
And I presume if you wanted a bed, you could find one there?
Yes.
Did that happen?
Yes.
How did you come to leave there?
How did I come to leave Owens? Well, I think the church was taking up more time of the ministry, and also the director, well, not director, the director. She was gaining, I guess, her strength back, and she was coming back in full time, and that's why the services of Roberta Brady were not basically needed anymore. But then, after some time, one of the owners of Owens Funeral Home had passed away, and before his passing, he had asked me to come in and assist with the Owens Funeral Home.
Did there come a time you worked at the J.E. Scott Funeral Home?
Yes.
That was in Akron?
That's in Akron.
What did you do there?
Assisted Mr. Scott in terms of transporting the deceased. Mr. Scott would then prep the body in terms of the actual embalming portion. Then he would, ask me to take the body out to get the body dressed, casketed, cosmetized, all of those same things I did at Owens, picking up the families, meeting the families at their home. I did those things for Mr. Scott.
Was Scott after Owens?
Scott was after Owens.
How did you happen to get hired there?
At Scott Funeral Home?
Yes.
Mr. Scott, he was aware of who I was and what I did and my pastoring. And so in passing, he would often say, Pastor, why don't you come over and work with me, and I think we can work good together. And he would also ask me to come over because he wanted me to bring him, basically business too. And I worked for him for just a short time.
KK. Let me show you what I've marked as Exhibit KK. You familiar with that?
Yes, sir.
What is it?
That is a J.E. Scott flyer.
Do you recall what time frame this is from?
This is, I want to say, about 2015, 2013, in that area.
And you're described there as what?
As mortuary student, non-licensed funeral director. So they've been when I was in mortuary school.
Not a funeral director?
Not a funeral director, non-licensed funeral director.
How long did you continue to work with Scott?
I worked for Mr. Scott just for a short time, about maybe 3 or 4 months.
What happened?
He just, one day, he called me and says, hey, I'm taking off. That's all he did. And he transferred me a phone number one day, and that was it. I had never heard from Mr. Scott again until maybe a year or two ago.
Did you have information to allow you to ship on Mr. Scott's shipping license for repatriation?
Did I have permission?
Did you have information that would have allowed you to do that?
I had information, but not necessarily that would have allowed me to do it.
Have you ever used Mr. Scott's license for the transportation of bodies?
No, sir.
Did there come a time when we were interviewed by a place called Seven Ponds?
Yes.
What do you understand Seven Ponds to be?
Seven Ponds is a blog. I believe that deals with different things when it comes to the funeral home and mortuary industry. And Seven Ponds.
Still with us, attorney Nima Rahmani. Nima, I'd like your final thoughts for this hour. And do you find the defendant disingenuous, or do you find him credible for a judge, not a jury, to believe?
Well, the former prosecutor to me thinks he's not credible, but it's going to be interesting because not only is there going to be an intense and aggressive cross-examination, but this judge is going to ask his own questions because we've seen him do so of other witnesses. So we're going to have really one round of intense cross-examination, but the judge's pointed questions, that's going to be interesting, Ashley, to see how he views this witness.
And, to your point, you're right. The judge has asked a lot of questions. I, as a judge, used to ask a lot of questions because if I was the finder of fact, I wanted everything answered. Some argue, though, as a defense attorney, that's not your job. That's the prosecutor's job. Where do you find on this, the judge asking questions piece of this trial?
Yeah, it's typically something you don't see when there's a jury trial. But, when the judge is making a decision, I think it's fine if he or she asks the questions. Ultimately, if you're the attorney, you want to know what the judge cares about because he or she is the ultimate decider of fact.
Absolutely. Nima, you're going to stay with us. Coming up, we're going to play the rest of Shante Harden's testimony and then shift to our other big cases. More on today's sentencing in the Playboy murder case, as well as the latest on Brittany Griner and her bid for freedom. Stay with us here on Court TV, your front row seat to justice. Welcome back to Court TV Live. I'm Judge Ashley Wilcott. Thank you for joining us this hour. We are monitoring developments in several cases. First, we have the biggest moments from today's sentencing trial for the Parkland shooter. The murder weapon was on display earlier today. Emotions are still running high as expert witnesses are now revealing autopsy photos to the jury. We are watching parents reacting from the gallery as they relive the nightmare. Then breaking news in the Playboy murder case. The boyfriend of a one-time model was sentenced to 18 years for beating a man to death. This as Kelsey Turner still awaits her day in court for allegedly setting up that murder of the wealthy psychiatrist she was seeing. And finally, will an American prescription for medical cannabis get Brittany Griner leniency in a Russian court? The basketball star was in court today. Now she's pled guilty to drug charges and faces up to 10 years in prison. Court TV will have more on that story as it develops. But first, let's get you back into the courtroom in Ohio. The defendant, Shante Harden, he is charged with many counts, including fraudulent disposal of bodies and fraud of monies, all of these things relating to individuals who utilized his services to bury their deceased and to have services for their deceased. This is in Ohio, multiple charges. He's on the stand. He's the fourth witness to take the stand for the defense. And remember, this is a bench trial. This means that a judge will make the decision, not a jury. You haven't missed any of his testimony. Let's get you back into the courtroom.
In terms of my, what I represented in terms of the mortuary funeral industry.
And ultimately, the results of that interview were published?
Yes.
In the blog?
In the blog.
Let me hand you what we marked as Exhibit I. Is this the interview I just mentioned?
Yes.
In it, do you indicate that you're a funeral director?
No, sir.
Let me take you down to the second paragraph on the first page. How do you describe yourself there?
The second paragraph?
Or first paragraph, I guess. I apologize.
A funeral guide.
And you also say a disposition specialist?
Yes.
But not a licensed funeral director?
Not a licensed funeral director.
And so far as you know, this was put on the internet and published to anyone who wanted to read it?
Yes.
And you describe your involvement, the bottom page 1, as being fascinated. What does that describe your interest as being?
What paragraph is that?
It's the bottom one.
Bottom one. Yes, I see that.
What does it say about what your interest was stimulated by?
By the cars, the hearses and limousines, and the concept of death itself.
And you want to know what happens in the back room?
Yes.
Are you familiar with what are called death doulas?
Yes, I am.
What do you understand a death doula to be?
Death doula is somebody who has the ability to assist and aid not just the person who is dying. It can serve in two concepts. That one instance is to assist a family and the person who is transitioning, the person that is dying. And then after that person has passed away, then they enter into the help of assisting the family in terms of getting the family through the process of the healing portion of death, but also through the funeral portion as well.
How long have death doulas been a thing?
The term death doula has been around probably for decades.
Okay. Do they publish in Ohio a list of all the death doulas?
Yes, if they call themselves a doula, that means a different term.
Let me hand you exhibits or show you Exhibit Z. Can you tell us what that is?
This is, looks like to be from the website National Home Funeral Alliance.
And it says Ohio All. What do you understand that to mean?
Ohio All would be all of the doulas or maybe all of the guides that the National Home Funeral Alliance is publicizing that they have the availability in Ohio too.
And there are a number of them.
Yes.
This exhibit is multi-page.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned the National Home Family or Home Funeral Alliance. What is that?
The National Home Funeral Alliance is an organization that is dedicated to showing families how not to, if they choose to, not to use a funeral home to bury their loved one.
Why would somebody want not to use a funeral director?
there's different reasons and rationale behind the concept of not using a funeral home. From my perspective and my experience, that because of your religious institution, you may not choose to use a funeral home. It may be based upon cost, which is a big factor why they don't want to use a funeral home. And there are just some families who just simply choose to do it themselves, who have neither rationale.
Is it possible for someone to get a death certificate without using
Yes.
a funeral home?
Yes.
How would that come about?
There's a form, it's called the Death Registration Without a Funeral Home. So anyone can call and get that form from the state of Ohio through the Ohio Department of Vital Statistics and Records. They will call in, get that form, fill that information out with the factual information from what the informant has told them, or what the informant may choose to fill out for themselves. You write it down and you take it to the local registrar's office. The local registrar office will send it into the state of Ohio. The state of Ohio will vet the information compared to the proper IDs and verifications that have been sent in. They will verify the doctor's information. I believe they call the doctor to verify that the death has occurred. And then once that portion happens and they verify the information, they will send it back to the local registrar's office. The local registrar's office will, after it's been entered into EDRS, the local registrar's office will see it, and then they will give the paper white copy, as it's referred to the person who's in charge of this position, and they will give it to them, and they will take it to the doctor to sign it, and then they will, after the doctor has signed that, the white copy of the death certificate, after it's been formulated from EDRS to the local board of registrar's office, then you can take it back to the health department where it's filed and certified.
Are you familiar with the Ohio Revised Code, Section 3715?
Yes.
And what does that deal with?
It deals with death registration by a funeral director or other person in charge of disposition.
And who can fill out a death certificate according to that statute?
Anyone
Objection.
can.
Have you?
Question of law here, perhaps for the court, not the witness.
That's
I-
what it sounds like, Your Honor.
I'll ask that you move on, Ms. Carter.
Now, the National Home Funeral Alliance also publishes a guide to people who can assist in funerals.
Yes, sir.
I've put Exhibit R up there. Have you been listed in this?
I have before.
I'm going to object, Your Honor, until it's identified that in some way this publication, this general publication, is binding upon the state of Ohio in some way, shape, or form.
I don't think it has to be binding on the state of Ohio at all. I'm going to go to what he was listed in here as.
Similarly, Mr. Carter, I'd like to know more about the background of the document.
Sure. Where does this come from?
This would be from the National Home Funeral Alliance's actual website.
And that alliance does what?
The National Home Funeral Alliance it's like a organization where they promote and help people who don't want to use licensed funeral homes.
Hence the name, National Home Funeral Alliance.
Yes.
And you have interacted with them over the years?
Yes, I have.
And have you had yourself listed in this particular directory?
Listed and was asked to be a speaker at several events.
And what were you listed as?
A funeral guide,
Not a funeral director.
not a funeral director.
Your Honor, I'm going to object again. This testimony is completely irrelevant. This has no bearing on the state of Ohio. It has no bearing on the charges that are pending in this
I
case.
believe in the state's case in chief, there was a reference to the home funeral group. I think it's the same name as this, but there was the testimony from your side of the ledger on home funerals, the Amish, et cetera, isn't there?
So we're talking about what a home funeral is, but we did not sit there and pull out some kind of general publication from an organization that can't be established as being anything other than a spurious organization, Your Honor. There's absolutely no credibility given to this organization anywhere other than the defendant says, well, I read it on the internet.
Your Honor,
Sounds like it's a question of weight, not of admissibility, so I'll overrule the objection.
Thank you, Judge. And just so it's clear, it's offered to show him holding himself out to the United States as a funeral guide, not as a funeral director. And we have multiple instances when he does that, and I think that undercuts the state's argument that he's telling everybody he's a funeral director. That's the purpose. Your Honor, I think it would probably be appropriate to break now. I'm going to get into another area that'll take a little time.
I believe you said that you had a witness ready to go.
I am supposed to. Sean, could you go see if the imam's out there?
Yes, sir.
We'll have to
From me, Your
stop
Honor.
down, Mr. Harden.
Thank you, Your Honor.